Will African leaders ever expose the West on the international stage? Almost all African nations at the UN summit recounted the exploitation each of their nations endured, and things turned ugly. No one expected this from the West, and the military missions they have been conducting were not expected to be like this. So what are African leaders demanding now? Let's find out. At a summit, the African leaders exposed what the US has been doing in the name of military activities. While all leaders tried their best to expose the West and the US, Burkina Faso shattered the West's image. It became brutally honest and said everything. But what did African leaders convey the overall message at the UN summit? At the UN summit, African leaders conveyed a multifaceted message highlighting their grievances, demands for accountability, and calls for genuine solidarity and equitable partnerships with the international community, particularly the Western world. African leaders, speaking with unwavering resolve and clarity, have brought to the forefront a critical issue that resonates deeply within the global community. At the heart of their discourse lies an observation: the profound disconnection between the lofty ideals professed within the chambers of international diplomacy and the harsh realities experienced on the ground. With eloquence and conviction, they have highlighted the glaring chasm between rhetoric and action, shedding light on the widening gap between the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and their implementation. Central to their message is a critique of the international community's failure to uphold the fundamental tenets of justice, equality, dignity, and adherence to international law. Year after year, during the grandiose spectacles of annual speeches and high-level summits, impassioned promises are made, pledges are reiterated, and commitments are solemnly proclaimed. Yet when measured against the litmus test of tangible progress and meaningful change, these assurances often ring hollow, exposing a disheartening pattern of inaction and selective engagement. Drawing upon real-world examples, African leaders have spotlighted the glaring inconsistencies and double standards that plague the global stage. They have pointed to the protracted crisis in Libya, a nation torn apart by conflict and instability, as a sobering illustration of the international community's failure to translate rhetoric into meaningful intervention and assistance. Despite the passionate appeals for peace and reconciliation, the plight of the Libyan people continues to be overshadowed by geopolitical interests and power struggles, leaving their aspirations for stability and prosperity unfulfilled. Similarly, the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine has served as a poignant reminder of the pervasive hypocrisy that pervades the corridors of power. In the face of blatant violations of sovereignty and territorial integrity, the principles of international law are often sacrificed at the altar of political expediency and strategic calculations. African leaders have not shied away from highlighting the glaring double standards that characterize the international community's response, where geopolitical considerations, temper condemnations, and accountability are often elusive for those who wield influence and power. In issuing their clarion call for intellectual honesty and moral accountability, African leaders have challenged the global community to confront the uncomfortable truths at the intersection of rhetoric and reality. They have urged a reckoning with the collective failure to bridge the gap between words and deeds, reminding us of the urgent imperative to align our actions with our professed principles. And what about the exploitation? In an unwavering stance against the perpetuation of external interference and exploitation, African leaders have unequivocally rejected the passive acceptance of Western influence and manipulation within the continent. With a rallying cry for unity and solidarity, they have called upon African nations to stand together as a formidable collective force determined to safeguard the sovereignty and self-determination of their respective nations. Central to their message is a firm repudiation of imperialist agendas and the insidious tactics employed to undermine African autonomy and agency. Drawing attention to instances of coercion, blackmail, and attempts to impose foreign interests, they have laid bare the mechanisms of manipulation that have long been wielded to subjugate and divide African nations. Whether through economic coercion, political pressure, or military intervention, African leaders have highlighted the relentless efforts to perpetuate a neo-colonial order that subverts the aspirations of African people and undermines the progress of the continent as a whole. In emphasizing the imperative of African unity, leaders have recognized the collective strength that lies in solidarity and collaboration. By forging alliances and partnerships rooted in mutual respect and shared interests, they seek to counteract the forces of exploitation and destabilization that threaten to undermine African sovereignty. Through regional blocs, multilateral initiatives, and diplomatic coalitions, they envision a future where African nations stand shoulder to shoulder, fortified against external interference, and empowered to chart their course of development and progress. A genuine commitment to self-determination and autonomy is at the heart of their demand for respect for African sovereignty. They reject any attempts to dictate the fate of African nations from afar, asserting the inherent right of African people to shape their destinies free from external coercion or manipulation. In doing so, they affirm the principles of dignity, agency, and freedom upon which the struggle for African liberation has long been grounded. But why are African leaders saying this publicly? African leaders at the UN summit aim to address long-standing grievances on the international stage through a combination of bold rhetoric, diplomatic assertiveness, and strategic messaging. African leaders openly criticized perceived injustices and exploitation perpetrated by the Western world. They utilized the global platform of the UN summit to shed light on issues such as diplomatic hypocrisy, conflict manipulation, and economic exploitation, thereby raising awareness and garnering international attention. African leaders demanded intellectual honesty and moral accountability from the international community, particularly Western nations. They called for an end to the disconnect between rhetoric and action, emphasizing the need for genuine adherence to principles such as justice, equality, and international law. African leaders also emphasized the importance of African unity and solidarity as a collective force to resist imperialist manipulation and destabilization. They sought to challenge the prevailing power dynamics and assert African agency globally by presenting a united front. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The leaders also wanted to expose the structural exploitation underlying Western involvement in Africa, particularly in deploying peacekeeping forces. They highlighted the true intentions behind such deployments, revealing the exploitation of Africa's natural resources and the perpetuation of conflicts for economic gain. The leaders called for a paradigm shift in international relations, marked by genuine solidarity, equitable partnerships, and mutual respect. They urged the international community to move away from paternalistic approaches and towards collaborative efforts based on respect for African sovereignty and self-determination. What made Burkina Faso's address particularly daring and attention-grabbing? For several reasons, Burkina Faso's address at the 2023 UN Summit stood out as daring and attention-grabbing. Burkina Faso's representative delivered a searing address, piercing the veil of diplomatic niceties to confront Western leaders with uncomfortable truths about their actions and policies in a bold departure from diplomatic convention. Changing the artifice of diplomatic language, they wielded blunt and unvarnished words to lay bare the stark realities that belied the rhetoric emanating from Western capitals, challenging the prevailing narrative with unwavering sincerity and conviction. With a fearless determination to speak truth to power, Burkina Faso's representatives left no room for ambiguity as they exposed the glaring disparities between Western rhetoric and actions. Their words cut through the veneer of righteousness that often shrouds Western interventions and policies, revealing instead the harsh realities of exploitation, manipulation, and double standards that have defined Western engagement with the global South. In choosing to employ blunt language, Burkina Faso's representative signaled a refusal to engage in diplomatic charades or mince words to appease the sensibilities of Western leaders. Instead, they opted for a direct and unapologetic approach, unafraid to confront Western leaders with the uncomfortable truths they would prefer to ignore. By challenging the prevailing narrative, Burkina Faso's representative shattered the illusion of moral superiority that often accompanies Western interventions and policies. Through their blunt language, they exposed the hypocrisy and inconsistency that underlie Western actions, demanding accountability and introspection from those who wield power and influence on the global stage. In doing so, Burkina Faso's representative embodied the spirit of resistance and defiance that has long characterized the struggle for justice and equality in the face of hegemonic dominance. Their words were a rallying cry for the marginalized and oppressed, challenging the status quo and inspiring others to speak truth to power in pursuing a more just and equitable world. The representative delivering the address was attired in military uniform, symbolizing strength and authority. This choice of attire added gravity to the message and underscored Burkina Faso's resolve to assert its interests and demand accountability. Burkina Faso's address demanded intellectual honesty and moral accountability from the international community, particularly Western nations. By calling out diplomatic hypocrisy and manipulation of conflicts, the address forced Western leaders to confront uncomfortable truths and reckon with their actions. The address exposed the structural exploitation underlying Western involvement in Africa, particularly in the deployment of peacekeeping forces. It highlighted the true intentions behind such deployments, revealing the exploitation of Africa's natural resources and the perpetuation of conflicts for economic gain. Its address also emphasized the importance of African unity and solidarity as a collective force to resist imperialist manipulation and destabilization. By presenting a united front, Burkina Faso challenged the prevailing power dynamics and asserted African agency globally. And here came the leader the West feared, Ibrahim Traore. How did Captain Ibrahim Traore's speech confront Western influence in Africa? His speech directly confronted Western leaders with the harsh realities of their actions and policies in Africa. It denounced diplomatic hypocrisy and manipulation of conflicts, forcing Western nations to confront uncomfortable truths about their involvement in African affairs. Captain Ibrahim Traore's speech exposed the structural exploitation underlying Western involvement in Africa. It highlighted how Western nations, under the guise of peacekeeping missions, have capitalized on Africa's abundant natural resources and perpetuated conflicts for economic gain. The speech demanded intellectual honesty and moral accountability from the international community, particularly Western nations. It called for an end to the disconnect between rhetoric and action, urging Western leaders to align their actions with the principles of justice, equality, and adherence to international law. Now, the question is, what were the demands of these leaders? Accountability is a crucial aspect of the demands made by Burkina Faso's representative. The call for accountability mechanisms is essential to ensure that Western nations are held responsible for their actions and policies, particularly concerning their interactions with countries in the global South. Burkina Faso's representative called for independent investigations into various aspects of Western engagement, including allegations of human rights violations, war crimes, and instances of exploitation or manipulation. These investigations would need to be conducted by impartial bodies with the authority to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and hold perpetrators accountable. There was also a demand for greater transparency in Western nations' actions and policies, particularly concerning their interactions with developing countries. This could involve calls for disclosing information related to trade agreements, development assistance, military interventions, and other forms of engagement. Burkina Faso's representative also called for legal accountability for those responsible for human rights violations, war crimes, or other egregious actions. This could include advocating for prosecuting individuals or entities implicated in such crimes before international tribunals or domestic courts. In cases where Western actions or policies have inflicted harm upon vulnerable populations, reparations are demanded to address the consequences of such harm. This could involve financial compensation, rehabilitation programs, or other restitution to restore dignity and justice to affected communities. And what do they have to say about sovereignty? The representative also demands an end to Western nations' interventionist practices, particularly in regions such as Africa that have historically been subject to external interference. This includes calls for the withdrawal of foreign military forces, an end to covert operations aimed at destabilizing sovereign governments, and respect for the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations. Burkina Faso's representative calls for genuine respect for sovereign nations' national decision-making processes. This would entail recognizing the authority of elected governments to make decisions that reflect the will and interests of their citizens, free from external coercion or manipulation. There is also a demand to cease Western nations' attempts to impose foreign agendas on sovereign states. This involves advocating for an end to conditional aid and loans, contingent upon adopting specific policies favored by donor countries, and rejecting attempts to impose neoliberal economic reforms or Western values and ideologies. And what about the partnerships? Burkina Faso's representative has articulated a pressing need to establish equitable partnerships between Western nations and those in the global South. In a stirring appeal for fairness and solidarity, they have called for a paradigm shift in international relations, advocating for fair trade practices, debt relief, and transferring technology and resources to bolster sustainable development efforts. With eloquence and conviction, the representative has highlighted the entrenched inequalities perpetuating the marginalization of developing nations, particularly in Africa. They have underscored the urgent necessity of rectifying these disparities by cultivating partnerships grounded in mutual respect and shared benefits. Central to their demands is a call for fair trade practices that prioritize the interests of all parties involved. They have emphasized the need to dismantle trade barriers and eliminate exploitative practices that disadvantage developing countries, advocating for a system that fosters equitable economic growth and development. Furthermore, Burkina Faso's representative has called for comprehensive debt relief measures to alleviate the burden of debt that stifles the progress of many nations in the global South. They have urged Western nations to fulfill their debt forgiveness and restructuring commitments, recognizing the vital importance of freeing up resources for investment in essential services and infrastructure. In addition to addressing economic disparities, the representative has stressed the importance of technology and resource transfer to support sustainable development efforts. They have called for sharing knowledge, expertise, and technology to empower developing nations to address pressing challenges such as climate change, food security, and healthcare. Through their impassioned plea for equitable partnerships, Burkina Faso's representative has issued a clarion call for solidarity and cooperation on the global stage. They envision a future where nations work together as equal partners, pooling their resources and expertise to build a more just and sustainable world for all. We have also talked about how they exposed exploitation, so what are their demands regarding that? Burkina Faso's representative has articulated a compelling demand to end exploitative practices that have long plagued the international community. These practices perpetuate economic dependency while exacerbating inequalities within and between nations. With a relentless call for justice and fairness, they have highlighted the urgent need for transformative measures to address the root causes of poverty and underdevelopment. Central to their demands is an emotional plea for fair labor practices that uphold the dignity and rights of workers. They have condemned exploitative labor conditions that exploit vulnerable populations, advocating instead for the implementation of regulations that ensure fair wages, safe working conditions, and respect for labor rights. Furthermore, Burkina Faso's representative has called for stringent regulations on resource extraction to prevent the exploitation of natural resources at the expense of local communities and the environment. They have emphasized the importance of sustainable resource management practices, prioritizing environmental conservation and equitable distribution of benefits. In addition to addressing labor and resource exploitation, the representative has urged comprehensive measures to tackle the root causes of poverty and underdevelopment. They have called for education, healthcare, and infrastructure investments to empower marginalized communities and promote inclusive growth. Through their impassioned plea for an end to exploitative practices, Burkina Faso's representatives have issued a powerful indictment of the status quo and a bold vision for a more just and equitable world. They envision a future where nations work together to eradicate exploitation and build a world where every individual has the opportunity to thrive. In a poignant conclusion to their impassioned plea, Burkina Faso's representative has issued a heartfelt call for solidarity and support from the international community to empower marginalized nations and peoples in their quest for justice, equality, and self-determination. With unwavering conviction, they have highlighted the importance of collective action in addressing the pressing challenges facing society's most vulnerable members. Central to their appeal is a recognition of the power of solidarity in effecting meaningful change. They have called for strengthened regional cooperation among nations, emphasizing the importance of unity in confronting shared challenges and pursuing common goals. By fostering greater collaboration and mutual support, they envision a future where nations work together as equals to overcome barriers to development and achieve sustainable progress. Furthermore, Burkina Faso's representative has highlighted the crucial role of grassroots movements in driving social change and advancing the interests of marginalized communities. They have called for support and recognition for the tireless efforts of activists, community leaders, and civil society organizations who champion the rights of the disenfranchised and advocate for positive transformation at the grassroots level. In addition to promoting solidarity and grassroots activism, the representative has emphasized the importance of humanitarian aid in addressing the immediate needs of those most affected by poverty, conflict, and injustice. To uphold their basic rights and dignity, they have called for increased assistance to vulnerable populations, including refugees, internally displaced persons, and marginalized communities. Through their stirring call for solidarity and support, Burkina Faso's representatives have reaffirmed the timeless values of compassion, empathy, and solidarity at the heart of the human experience. They have reminded the international community of its collective responsibility to stand in solidarity with the marginalized and oppressed, offering hope for a future where justice, equality, and self-determination are not mere aspirations, but lived realities for all. Do you think the West needs to stop torturing African nations? Is Africa not bearing any oppression because of the new leaders? Let us know in the comment section what you have to say about the African leaders' courage. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.